Hello, everyone. Welcome to Net Diligence Virtual Cyber Risk Summit. My name is Heather Osborne, and I'm the Director of Global Events and Programming at Net Diligence, a cyber risk assessment and data breach services company. Net Diligence is pleased to bring our thought-leading content to the virtual space with this new webinar series. Visit our website at www.netdiligence.com to get more information about our upcoming webinars and in-person events. Before we begin, I'd like to extend our heartfelt gratitude to our virtual Cyber Risk Summit sponsors, particularly Aspen Insurance, our diamond sponsor. I'd also like to thank our 100-plus speakers for bringing their thought leadership to our program. For today's webinar, we will be using the On24 platform. Right now, you should be viewing the On24 dashboard, which shows the live viewing screen. During the webcast, all participants will be in listen-only mode. Today's presentation is slated for approximately 45 minutes, with 15 minutes at the end for questions. Our panel of speakers will be taking questions throughout the session via the questions widget. Please type in questions during the presentation and click submit. If your question is of immediate import or concerns technical problems, you will receive an immediate answer by text. You can also find a widget entitled Resources, where you can download assets provided by the speakers and sponsors for each webinar. Just click the resource in the box and it will be automatically downloaded. If you are interested in receiving CLE or CE accreditation for this program, you must stay on for the full duration of the webinar and answer 3 polling questions that will appear during the course of the program. Additionally, please fill out the participant information questions. This will ensure that you are correctly matched to the state and professional organization. As a reminder, this webcast is being recorded. After the presentation, you will receive an archive link for further review or for sharing. The webinar will also be available for future viewing on our website. Again, thank you for joining the Net Diligence Virtual Cyber Risk Summit. We hope you enjoy the program.
Good morning or good afternoon, depending upon where and what part of the globe you're logging in from. I want to welcome you to today's presentation on how to build a compliance program without breaking the bank. I am really excited to be presenting this panel to discuss best practices for building a cybersecurity program, especially on a limited budget. And when we first thought of this idea pre-COVID as a possible workshop, who knew just how important this topic would be? I think it's critical, and I also think it's very complex. COVID-19 has strained businesses across the globe. The need for businesses to transform into a sudden remote operations model has added further strain and operational cost. It's also increased risk. Cybersecurity requirements continue to expand, and cyber attacks are on the rise as organizations and nation states are taking advantage of the disruption caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. We have an excellent panel to discuss best practices and complexities behind building a program. It will not be a one-size-fits-all or an industry-specific discussion, and we hope that no matter what size or industry your organization is in, you will walk away from this presentation with helpful takeaways and a better idea on different approaches toward building or amending a cybersecurity program. My name is Josh Mooney, and I am the chair of the Cybersecurity and Data Protection Group of the law firm White & Williams. I am also the firm's acting chief privacy officer. And normally as a moderator, I would introduce the remainder of our panel. But given that we are presenting this by webinar, and to help enable you to quickly recognize each panel's voice, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. So Steve, could you introduce yourself?
Absolutely, Josh. My name is Steve Greenawalt, and I am the Director of Managed Services with DFDR Consulting. We are a digital forensics, cybersecurity penetration testing, and incident response provider in the Metro Philadelphia region. I've been in the information technology field for approximately 15 years at this point and have served in various roles, including systems administration and a short stint working for the United States military maintaining convoy simulators. In my current role, I work with our clients of varying sizes to deliver our managed service technologies to them, and assist with their day-to-day needs. Prior to this role at DFDR, I was also part of the digital forensics and penetration testing team as well.
Thank you, Steve. And Liz, how about you?
Hi there. Yep. Thank you. My name is Liz Hinkle. I'm Associate General Counsel of Privacy at 2U. 2U is an education technology company that partners with universities worldwide to power remote learning opportunities, such as coding boot camps, short course certificates, and full degrees. In my current role, I manage the privacy program at 2U. As you know, privacy is kind of the flip side of the coin of cybersecurity, and I partner quite closely with our cyber team to ensure that we have an appropriate program for the products that we manage.
Thank you, Liz. And Kerry?
Hi. Thanks, Josh. Hi, my name is Kerry Manaster, and I'm a former CISO for 8 years at a financial services firm. Right now, I'm sitting on the Cloud Security Alliance Minnesota board as vice president. And really the objective of the Cloud Security Alliance is our mission is to define and raise awareness of best practices to ensure a secure cloud computing environment.
Fantastic. So let's go first to our first polling question. True or false? A data security program has to be complex, expensive. It takes a long time to set up and implement. Liz, what do you think about that? True or false?
Well, I'd say that that's absolutely false. You know, you wouldn't have. I mean, it's true in some sense, and then also false at the same time, right? In that you don't necessarily need to have something that is complex and expensive to have a cybersecurity program. You do need to have something that is fulsome in nature, and that appropriately. The complexity of the program, in other words, should be appropriate to the product that you develop or the organization that you support.
So, and that really brings us then to our presentation. I think, Liz, your response sums it up perfectly. Sometimes there's a little bit of truisms in that observation, and sometimes the idea of a program having to be complex and expensive is not always the case. So what we're going to do today is we're going to discuss about how to begin a program, whether you're starting from scratch or you have something already in place and you need to expand or amend it. We're going to discuss setting up that program and specifically the buy-in that one needs to get with their company, and whether it's from management level to an employee rank and file level. We're going to talk about laying the brickwork. What exactly, putting the meat on the bones of a cybersecurity program. And then we're also going to discuss some risks to consider and address when building or expanding upon a cybersecurity program. And then we're going to discuss some final thoughts. Which really brings us to and this really brings us to the first issue, is how to address building a cybersecurity program in a general context of a general discussion. I mean, because we have, Steve, isn't it true? I mean, every company is going to have different risks, the different contexts depending upon the industry they're in, the type of operations they have, the type of data they have. So it's this is a bit of, this afternoon is going to be a bit of a fluid conversation.
Yes, absolutely. So in its most basic terms, I mean, risk is essentially the possibility or probability that something bad is going to happen to an organization or an outcome. And the risk mindset is really just trying to think probabilistically about every facet of your business. And I know this seminar is really focused on data and privacy risk, but risk spans an entire organization, and companies need to be cognizant of that so that they can make informed decisions that benefit their business.
So, and that brings us to the first item on our agenda is the beginning, or the genesis of either starting a cybersecurity program from scratch or building upon or amending what already is in place. And a key factor in the beginning is to identify any regulatory or legal requirements in your industry or the standards of the industry. And many times shaping a program around a regulatory schematic or an industry-recognized standard can help establish a prima facie demonstration of a program with reasonable safeguards. Kerry, what are some of the legal frameworks that a company may look to in order to blueprint its cybersecurity program? And what are some potential advantages of looking to the legal frameworks?
Well, some of the frameworks that companies would look in would be NIST, which is very, very common. But NIST is mainly common in mainly North America. But so there's other frameworks out there that, you know, if you're an international company, you may want to be cognizant of NIST and its potential limitations, and you may want to look at ISO, for example. The other thing is NIST is very big and broad and has a lot of controls, and so if you're starting from the beginning, it could be very, very overwhelming. So there's other controls that you could look at from like the CIS controls, where it has a set of 20 controls that you can begin with. And the nice thing about CIS controls is that it aligns nicely with NIST, and if you choose to move to NIST or an ISO in the future, you're set up in a good place to move forward.
And Liz, if you really have nothing in place, you know, what are some items to identify or building blocks to identify in terms of you know, starting a program?
Yeah, in terms of starting a program from the ground up, you're going to want to identify, you know, first and foremost, who is what are your resources, and who are the people who are going to drive the controls and, you know, ensure that the program actually is successful. I think, you know, making sure that you have resources available to you is incredibly important, because if you don't have resources dedicated to building a program, to putting controls in place, then your controls will actually fail. I think also this kind of goes back to, you know, what Steve was talking about a little bit at a few minutes ago, which is, you know, what is the risk that your executive board is willing to accept, and what is their risk mindset and their appetite for risk. That also leads me to, you know, mention that you need to identify who the program is actually for. Are you performing the security program and the controls for the sake of regulatory requirements, or for auditors, or just simply for internal control and cybersecurity, you know, protection? Then you're also going to want to, you know, identify the legal framework that, you know, works for your business. You know, that goes to what Kerry was talking about in terms of the various frameworks that are available, you know, both from a regulatory perspective, but also from an industry-specific perspective. What is right for your company depends entirely on, you know, what your product is or what your organization is required to comply with. And then finally, you're going to want to continue to kind of define and refine your controls to accomplish compliance. I think, you know, one thing to keep in mind as if you're building from the ground up is that, you know, this is going to be an iterative process, and you need to prioritize appropriately in order to accomplish the broader goal of putting a program in place.
And Steve, what are some of the advantages of looking to either a legal or, in particular, an industry-specific framework. Like, for instance, the NIST cybersecurity framework, while perhaps not as common internationally, is certainly a fairly well-known cybersecurity framework here in the U.S.
Yeah, absolutely. So all of the different frameworks basically lay out controls and objectives that you're trying to achieve. And those provide both external and internal advantages to an organization that is going down that path. From the external side, these standard frameworks give you a roadmap to try to achieve some sort of betterment within the organization from a controls process, and allows you to identify the risks and reduce them through the implementation of those controls. And internally, again, you bolster the security and the processes that run the business, but you can rest a little easier by having those controls in place because things are going to run more smoothly. It also provides you with some marketing benefits where if you are going through the contracting process, somebody higher up in the supply chain may say, hey, you need to have SOC 1 or SOC 2 compliance, or you need to have another type of compliance to be eligible for this contract. And if you aren't in compliance with those different frameworks, then you're automatically excluded from being able to win that business.
So Liz, in your experience, what are some of the perspectives that you've seen in terms of building a program?
Yeah, I think you need to really kind of think about, time, resources, and discipline to complete compliance with your framework. You want to make sure that you're kind of thinking through, who should be responsible for this. So you don't want to have just a responsibility from, assigned to just one piece of the org. Cybersecurity is a cross-functional, cross-organizational function, really, that depends on the people just as much as, depends on as it depends on the cybersecurity team. Your team is as strong as your organization is in terms of, educating the business. I feel like, oftentimes you need to make sure that you're chatting, regularly with your executive team to make sure that you are continually giving them the insight they need into, how your program is doing, how you are thinking about, complying with the security framework and how that interplays with the broader company. Some of the things that you'll need to think about is, what happens if you do get audited, and what will the auditors expect you to adhere to, or what are your clients looking for in terms of controls and processes that you have in place. And then, you're also going to need to think about, how are you communicating the framework, not just to the executive team, but again, to the rest of the business, making sure that they understand that this is something that's important and that we need to be continually thinking of. I think that, finally, you need to make sure that you're focusing on reducing disruption to the program and controls, and thinking through how to accomplish that, whether it's, looking to metrics in terms of, monitoring, or looking to web traffic history, or whether it's looking for, a smaller test group or focus group across the business, and then expanding beyond that.
And Kerry, what are some of the perspectives that you've seen when a company is either starting off with building a program or coming in and realizing, you know what we have in place is just not mature enough?
Yeah, Liz brings up excellent points. And the one thing I want to reemphasize, your end audience. Who is your audience in the end that you're presenting this to? What are they going to expect? I can't emphasize that, enough. But the other thing too is that when you're creating a framework and you're talking to the stakeholders, you're talking to employees, you're talking to customers, you're talking to auditors, it's your opportunity to build that trust and confidence in you and what you're doing. That is critical for a successful program, whether it's starting from the beginning or it's in progress and it's working. You need to build that trust and confidence. A lot of times there are going to be awkward situations where people are going to come up to you, ask you questions, and it could be personal questions too. You need to have that trust and they need to have that confidence in you to bring that dialogue alive. The other thing too is critical is just having the right mindset. All right, these frameworks, depending on what you choose, there's a lot of controls. But the point here I want to make, and make it very, very clear, is not all controls are for every single company in the way they conduct business. And if the control is not for you, what I highly, highly recommend is you document it, why you're not doing it, why you're not moving forward. And the reason being is because security is evolving, privacy is evolving. And so when you come back to that control, you'll be like, oh, this should be implemented right now. Well, maybe when you started your framework, it didn't make sense, but now you move forward, it does make sense. So it's critical that you have the right mindset and that you document controls, even if you're not using them, and you just explain why. The other thing, too, that's going to be very, very common is, I need help. I don't get it. I don't know what to do. And one thing that I could offer you, and I'm sure everyone on this board would be, or on this panel would agree to, is that we're here to help. So if you do have a question regarding a framework, if you have a question regarding, a control, we're here. You can always reach out to us. But another place that you can reach out to is a peer-to-peer group. And if you have one in your industry, I highly, highly recommend that you join that peer-to-peer group, because the information that you'll gain and the insights that you'll gain and you'll be able to share will be absolutely incredible. The other thing that you can get information from is associations. So, Cloud Security Alliance, they're starting a peer-to-peer group. Other associations I know from experience that they have it too. So again, just don't feel like you're alone. And then the last things I want to say is that with the framework, it allows you to manage risk, what Steve talked about a lot. It allows you to prioritize risk. It's a way to be transparent, not only with your stakeholders, but with your customers and with your employees. And then the key thing is that, you're going to be documenting everything. So it's a formalized way to document your process, your controls, your workflows. That, again, and I'll mention this one more time, is that the controls that relate to your business.
That's great, which brings us now to setting up the program. I mean, we've talked about, deciding what sort of framework are you going to look to, whether it's going to be based upon the regulatory or legal framework of the industry organization's in, or an industry recognized standards such as NIST or ISO. Putting someone who's going to be the point person who's going to be in charge, usually your CISO or CIO or CPO, addressing questions of why you're putting in framework, and also identifying who is this framework for, whether it's for an auditor, regulator, customer, client, consumer. But all that still needs the buy-in. The company from management down needs to realize the importance of the program and comply with it. Kerry, I'm going to go back to you. What are some of the onboarding problems with stakeholders that should be anticipated when somebody is building a program, and how do you overcome some of those obstacles?
One of the biggest challenges is not getting buy-in from everyone. And one way to mitigate that risk or that challenge is to create an onboarding team. And that onboarding team, is highly recommended to have people from different departments. And it does a few things. One, it gets everyone's buy-in. And then it also starts your communication strategy with your departments. That to me was an extremely critical function to set up, and then you meet on a regular basis. But more importantly, as a team on your board, you decide, and you prioritize risk. And again, from the very, very beginning, what Steve said, it's all about risk. So the template guides you, but then now you have business owners, stakeholders helping you out with prioritizing risk and what's more important, and you're getting buy-in from everyone. The other thing too is then you have a sign-off process, and then for your different controls and workflows that you're putting in place. So those are critical things for onboarding. The final thing is that you want to be able to test your controls, so thinking a little bit down the line. And really, you don't want to roll out control just to everyone. If possible, you want to create a pilot group. And that pilot group should be a group of people, obviously, that trust you and you trust them. But the key thing is they give open and honest feedback. So you can roll out controls to them, and you could then test those controls and get immediate feedback to adjust the controls based on the workflows. And one other thing that's critical for this group is that it should be someone from different departments that has different workflows. So you're testing out these controls in different workflows.
And Liz, what are some of the onboarding problems I mean, Kerry's coming a little bit more from the technical side. You're in-house counsel, and you're in the general counsel's department. From somebody who's sitting in from the legal side, what are some of the onboarding challenges and onboarding success stories of that legal counsel can see for a company?
I think there's a real focus on controls and frameworks, and making sure that you're testing and controls and keeping controls in place. I think from my perspective, what's been helpful is to kind of think about it a little bit more broadly than just the controls that are in place, and how to test them, and making sure that you're setting yourself up for success from a framework perspective. From my end of things, I tend to think about cybersecurity and privacy by design, which is a little bit more broad than that strict controls conversation. For example, I think you want to make sure that as you're talking about putting controls in place, you're adequately communicating that that this is not just a check-the-box opportunity. This is a mindset and a way that the product team and the tech team and all of the other teams who are involved in this need to continue to view their product through that lens as they build. If you don't have that lens, that privacy and cybersecurity by design lens implemented, at the project management or the product management level, then your security framework compliance will ultimately fail because you won't have created that layer that pushes your business logically to that compliance. And I think that's incredibly important to make sure that you're keeping that lens actively feeding that lens and actually actively proselytizing that, you need to be focusing on these things across the business.
No, and of course, that brings up a really good point. In my experiences working with clients, some of the difficulties I've seen is a company will try to adopt a cybersecurity program that is just too mature for its operations, or alternatively, they'll say that they do something, or they'll check off a control saying, look, yeah, we have this control in place, when in fact they don't. And certainly from my end of it, there's an old saying, having a program you don't comply with can be just as bad, and in some ways worse than not having a program at all. When looking at programs and whether or not an organization has an end goal of trying to have a very complex, deep, mature program, it's important that the program grow organically and that the company can actually do what it says it's doing. Kerry, what are some of the unexpected risks and things to consider when beginning to put a program into place?
When you're beginning to put a program into place, we discussed earlier about that cross-functional, cross-department team, and that team is not only overseeing and helping out with the framework, but they're also helping out with bits and pieces and parts of critical components of that framework. And a lot of times, companies look into, the onboarding process, and they're talking about the onboarding process and how the onboarding process is going to work. It's critical that team comes in agreement for that onboarding process, but what also is critical is also looking at the offboarding process. How do you handle offboarding? What is the process? What is the workflow? Because it's not only IT. It is part of it. IT doesn't have access to HR systems or sensitive information, so you need to involve these other departments and teams, and you need to look at things as a unity. And Liz mentioned earlier, you've got to look at the bigger picture of the organization, and this is one critical part that you need to look at. The other thing, too, is that when you're talking about onboarding and offboarding, what about horizontal moves for an employee? This is a lot of times overlooked in organizations. And specifically what I'm talking about, getting into little details, is when someone moves from one department to another department, their security access should change. But a lot of times there's a transition period. And that transition period is forgotten by IT, and then this person has, access that they don't need anymore. So it's critical that you handle, you have a workflow and a process in place for horizontal moves as well as offboarding. The other thing too, it's critical just to think about it this way: is if you don't handle offboarding or horizontal, moves, what's at risk? Your security risk exposure. You have potential internal threat from an employee, and then a potential bad employee experience. So these are just some critical things that you need to think about.
And just jumping in on the back of that, I think that, yes, absolutely, there's this risk factor of internal threat profile that, could be from a bad actor, or from, just simply accidental, to your point, that horizontal movements, having sloppy offboarding processes can, result in accidental disclosures of data, or result in an employee, possibly being hacked and, having more access to data than they should have. But there's also like an external factor to this as well, thinking about where, not only where you're ingesting data and how you're ingesting data, but then like how are you passing that data onward? And I think we'll touch on this a little bit down the road in this conversation, but I think a lot of your external risk profile comes from the vendors that you onboard, and so you need to be really cognizant of, how you bring them on board, how you take them off board as well, and what risks you're opening yourself up to as you're kind of looking to bring on new vendors.
So, Steve, here's a really basic question, but one that really I think people overlook the critical aspects of it. Is what exactly is a risk assessment, and how can conducting a risk assessment help with both the buy-in process as well as uncovering some of the unexpected risks and factors that Kerry and Liz have been talking about?
Yeah, so risk assessments they're a critical and likely underutilized tool that can be leveraged for the benefit of any organization. The risk assessment process allows an individual or an organization to systematically analyze a given threat or vulnerability and attempt to quantify the probability of its occurrence and potential impacts in the event that it happens. I think that they should be deployed throughout all areas of the business and don't pertain solely to IT or privacy concerns. I think they're a valuable tool to foster buy-in from management or any stakeholders in the given situation, because at their core, it's simply a cost-benefit analysis. The information contained within the risk assessment will allow management to make an informed decision about how to eliminate, mitigate, or live with the referenced issue. And for our insurance professionals in attendance, I mean, once a business has a fuller picture of what they can reasonably live with, they'll be able to insure against all of the other risks that they can't get rid of or they're unwilling to live with.
So, Kerry, as part of laying the brickwork, so to speak, of the program and really implementing it, also requires an organization to take a data inventory and a device inventory, which in of itself, even describing it sounds both challenging and intimidating. But what exactly goes into a data and device inventory?
Well, I'll start with data first. Data, depends on the organization, can be extremely complex and challenging. And the way that, I've accomplished this in the past is creating a simple Excel spreadsheet to start out with and created a data matrix. And the reason why I do that and what I've found out in organizations is that there's no central, workflow for data to come into an organization. And that's a challenge. And that's a challenge from many different points of view. One is that the biggest thing is that you could be wasting a ton of money, and you could have redundant data sets or data sets that, complement each other, and you don't need both data sets. So again, redundant data sets. The other thing is that the contracts of the data sets, there are restrictions in the contract. You need to understand those restrictions. There could be security controls for that data and how you should be protecting that data and who should be accessing that data. So for those reasons, it's critical that you have a central workflow for data coming into an organization.
Oh, and how about with devices? How does a company do a device inventory?
Well, the device inventory, from my experience, I wouldn't even start out with technology first. I would start out with a mindset of trying to find state of a device. So is that device active? Is that device retired? Is that device, in storage? So what is the nomenclature that you want to use to define the device state? Then the other thing is there any metadata that goes along with particular devices? So for example, You know, do you want to have a cost field for certain devices? Do you want to, you know, have a point person, you know, that, you know, who you should go ask, you know, about a particular device? So again, it's trying to set up your metadata structure and your structure for devices. The other thing is that you want to think about, is your device managed or is it not managed? And for my, you know, for definition purposes, the way I'm defining manage and not manage right here is a device that, you know, you regularly update, you know, whether patching, security patches, or firmware updates. That's a managed device, where another device you just really don't see, you know, for a long time. And that could be access control, which, you know, in my experience rarely gets updated. Lighting control, you know, you just set it and then it's just working forever. Air conditioning, you know, these are just devices that, you know, are, you know, just there and always working, and you know when it's not working, and they don't think about security patches. So again, once you set up and think about all these different things, then you want to try to get a tool that could catalog and categorize, you know, using your taxonomy, your metadata, you know, to be able to search a searchable database. And again, there's a lot of tools out there that are available. But again, the goal is you want to try to have one tool, you know, is ideal, but again, it's sometimes very, very hard, so you may need to have one or two tools. But again, try to, you know, the more tools, the more complexity. You want to make it less complex.
So, and Liz, you know, oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Steve.
Sorry, Josh. I was going to say, just to follow on to Kerry's stance on data. I mean, the data itself is a risk as well. And you want to classify it and organize it so you know what data you need to have and what data you no longer need to hold on to. Because, I mean, in 2020, storage is incredibly cheap. So individuals, organizations, we've all effectively become digital hoarders because we never really have a reason to get rid of data. But if you are housing a lot of data containing PII or PHI or other sensitive or controlled information, if you have a security incident, now the potential pool of information or people that you need to identify could potentially increase if you're holding on the data from 20 years ago that you have no legitimate regulatory or business need to continue to maintain.
And that's an absolutely great point. Yeah. Sorry, Josh. That's an absolute great point. And in the matrix also, too, you want to try to define use cases and how the data is being used. You want to also, you know, place where the data is located. That's critical. So again, absolutely agree 100%, you know, Steve, and thank you for bringing that up.
Which really brings us into, I mean, part of the issue with cybersecurity program is, you know, the policies in many ways are the pistons that make the program go, and the data retention is a perfect example. If you don't have a good data retention program, when you're hanging on to data, you could be in violation of a lot of data privacy and security rules. You know, Liz, taking a look at, you know, from an organization that's implementing a program, you know, what are some steps to identify and address what policies should be written and implemented first? Like, how do you prioritize this?
Yeah, I think this all comes down to risk identification and prioritization. I think you really need to understand, first and foremost, what is your product? You need to interview across the company. Again, as we've all said throughout this conversation, this is a cross-organizational, you know, task that, you know, you need to get. So because in order to accomplish that kind of cross-organizational embedding of, you know, cybersecurity and privacy by design, you need to have the interviews with individuals through a cross-section of the company so that you get an understanding of, you know, what risks are inherent in current processes. And then, you know, you need to really understand from a leadership perspective, you know, what is their appetite for risk. I think I'm kind of repeating myself there on that point, but I do think that that's really important to be, you know, closely aligned with your executives on that point. Once you've gotten an idea for, what risks are inherent in current processes, then I think from a prioritization standpoint, in order to keep yourself from getting to analysis paralysis, you need to do some sort of risk ranking, right? So find the most risky things that are, currently in your processes and tackle those right away. And then, as you're doing this kind of like grand prioritization, kind of think about what are the things that are risky but don't need to be immediately addressed. What can be addressed, a year from now, 2 years from now. Again, this is going to continue to be an iterative process. It's something that you will be continually talking about, continually thinking about. So, how do you accomplish, building a successful program? Well, you have to have some level of prioritization in there. And that, again, I think goes back down to, what is the company's appetite for risk and how does it think about risk?
So this brings us to our next polling question. Data privacy security is primarily a IT issue, a risk management issue, a legal issue, a business issue, or all of the above? I'll let everyone take a few seconds to answer that. So one of the key issues with cybersecurity programs, and it's something that should not be forgotten, is training. Making sure that you're putting in the internal and external controls, but it really isn't helpful if people don't follow it or people don't know how to follow it. Liz, what are some of the things that an organization should do with regarding training for their personnel?
Training is absolutely pinnacle to having a successful cybersecurity program. I mean, if your people aren't thinking about the data that they're consuming and that they're processing throughout their day-to-day, then they absolutely won't know when to report something suspicious or when to report, a mistake or even, to Stephen Kerry's point earlier, when to get rid of data that they don't need to be processing, or how to minimize data so that they aren't overly ingesting data. I think, it doesn't have to be a full-on tabletop exercise, although those are absolutely indispensable and actually are quite useful in helping to highlight some of the weaknesses in your incident response program. Even if you're just starting with, a simple training program where, you have something off the shelf that kind of explains to your employee base why they need to be worried about cybersecurity, why they need to be worried about privacy, why they need to be worried about, or to take care of the data that they're continually interacting with throughout the day. I think that having some sort of formal program in place along those lines is very useful, and it gives you a point, or it gives you rather a control that you can point to that probably nicely fits into some of these frameworks that we've been talking about, wherein you can just say, well, here is the control that we're trying to meet here, employees, and you employees are responsible for helping us to meet that control.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and it really circles back to, when looking at a program, and we go back to the beginning of our discussion, you're looking at the industry and regulatory frameworks that you're in. I mean, for instance, like you're saying, Liz, I mean, training creates affirmative evidence that you're fulfilling your duty of care toward the protection of data that an organization holds. And there's some regulatory frameworks that For instance, the SEC holds that if your company does not have effective training or has not implemented training for its employees to address phishing attacks, it could be deemed to be in violation of the 1934 Securities Act. Another item that a lot of data security laws and requirements have is third-party risk management, which is a huge potential risk for any company that's handling and processing data. You know, Kerry, what are some of the issues or items that a company should consider and look at when taking into account a third-party risk management program for data security and privacy?
When you're talking about third-party risk management, you want to think about 3 different states or phases. One is onboarding, and so when you think about onboarding a vendor, is you want to look at their, make sure that their security controls align with yours, their policies align with yours as much as they can. And if not, that's the negotiating tactic. The other thing that's critical is that what are you going to do after year 1? How are you going to manage that vendor? What are you going to review? What are you going to make sure that they're doing or not doing? And then finally, the offboarding process, which is a lot of times forgotten, is, okay, you're no longer with a vendor, but what if they have data of yours? What's going to happen to that data? How's that data either removed, or what's their process? What's their workflow? And that's also something that you should consider at the very, very beginning. So to handle these 3 different states or phases is really highly recommend is that you have a centralized workflow from vendors coming in and going out to manage these different challenges with third-party vendors.
And so that brings us really to our final thoughts. And Steve, I'm going to turn to you. If an organization just do one thing today, what is it that they should?
That's a great question, Josh, and I think it's really hard to distill it down to just a single thing. So I'd like to give you, I guess, 2. And what I would do first and foremost for a company is you have to enable multi-factor authentication. Because all of our users, they are pretty predictable. So most users will use whatever the base password is, let's call it password, and then when they get the notification that they have to change it, more than likely they're going to change it to password 1 or password 2020. So knowing that, multi-factor authentication provides you with another level of security to protect against users using poor passwords. The second, it's a really broad topic, but it's something that we've kind of stressed throughout this entire seminar, is you've got to understand the full picture of your organization, whether it be hardware, software, data, anything within the organization. You have to have an understanding of what it entails, because if you don't know about it, how can you protect it or how can you secure it?
So, and Liz, what is, looking at in organizations in general and from your perspective of, being in-house, what is like one risk, or what is one of the biggest risks that, you think, wow, that this is something that the companies really should try to address as effectively and as soon as possible when they're looking to build a data security and compliance program?
Yeah, I struggle with, distilling something down to, one risk or one issue. But I do think that, Steve raised a great point that, you need to understand your threat landscape. Threats are not, I think a lot of organizations think that, external threat is the biggest risk, and that's not necessarily true. You need to be keeping in mind the internal risk, factors that you have control over, like your employee base or a bad actor employee, and make sure that you're keeping on top of those things in order to mitigate risk across the business.
And Kerry, how about you? Is based on your experiences on the technical side of things, what are some of the risks, or what is the one risk? And I agree, it's unfair to ask people to distill it down to just a single item. But what is the thing that used to keep you up at night?
The thing that keeps me up at night is threat actors don't sleep. They're constantly evolving. They're getting very, very creative. And so one area where it really scares me is email. Email, a lot of compromises, a lot of vulnerabilities happen through the email system. And one way to mitigate that risk, as we've been saying, is training, training, training. I can't emphasize that anymore, is that you need to protect your front line of your organization. You need to get them to become an asset, to let you know that potential vulnerabilities are coming in by them sending emails or communications to you very easily. You need to train them on, going to the source. If they doubt anything, have any single doubt about an email, always go to the source. Type in that URL to make sure that LinkedIn is sending you that messages, or that UPS is saying, hey, there's something wrong with your package. But that is the thing that keeps me up, is that, that the threat actors out there are getting very, very creative in the way that they're trying to get into their organizations and getting into people by using all this different data out there, from social media to LinkedIn accounts, and they're curating emails that are really down, getting into that emotional part of the employees to get them to click that link.
And so this brings us to our last polling question. Internal threats are blank external threats. Internal threats are more critical than, are less critical than, or just as critical as external threats. Liz, what are your thoughts about this question and how you've addressed internal threats?
I think, we spend a lot of time thinking about external threats and, how risk is coming from, hackers, et cetera. But I think internal threats actually are just as critical as external threats, really. I think, actually the most important point is that, when you find a threat, be it internal or external, give it the attention that it deserves, and make sure that your executives and other teams involved in the remediation effort have a full understanding of why it deserves the attention. That'll put you in a position where you'll be able to be more proactive in your approach and in adherence to a framework in the future. I think, never let a good incident go to waste, or a good threat go to waste.
And I agree with Liz. I think in the context of this question, internal threats are just as critical as external threats. The more nuanced response is that it depends. If you're an organization that's leveraging risk assessments, then you will be looking at each particular risk or threat, and you will be categorizing and prioritizing it accordingly. And based on the risk score and your risk acceptance, that'll dictate what is actually more or less critical than another threat.
Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time. I want to thank the panel for taking the time today for this presentation. I've certainly learned a lot, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have this conversation with the three of you. If we haven't had a chance to address your questions, certainly we can circle back and respond to them by email. But again, Liz, Kerry, and Steve, thanks so much for joining me this afternoon.